Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. And welcome to this panel called Policy Fundamental to Create Demand for Low Carbon Solution Along the Value Chain. My name is Magali Anderson. I am the Chief Sustainability and Innovation Officer for Holcim, and I'm very happy to host that panel today. So before I introduce my guest, I would like to just give a very short scene setting of what our challenges are, and let my guest after tell me what our solutions are. And so today, when you look at the mega trend, about 1.2 billion people today don't have a proper roof on their head. About 2.5 billion people are going to move to urban areas in the next 30 years. 60% of that infrastructure does not exist, which means we have to build the equivalent of New York City every month for the next 30 years. So I won't go any further because the idea is not to give a big course, but it's just to set the scene that if we don't fix today, now, how we are going to address the construction sector and how we are going to address how we are going to build and how we are going to live in those cities, then we might be in trouble. And so my dear panelists here, I've got Bertrand Picard with me on my left, who is the chairman of Solar Impulse Foundation. Thank you for being here, Bertrand. I've got her, I start with a lady. I've got Claire Bonham Carter, Director Sustainability of ECOM. And she might explain that to us after, but actually I was told that Claire came all the way to London by bicycle. All the way from London to Glasgow. Yes, of course. That's what I meant. So great to have you here and great to see this type of commitment. I'm actually very admirative. And we have Harry Vera, Head of Global Public, Head of Global Public and Government Affairs at Signify. Thank you for being with me. So without further ado, I would like to turn to you, Bertrand. I know with Solar Impulse Foundation, and we are very happy to be a member, that you've now labeled 1,300 solutions. I think it's absolutely amazing. We have a small part on it, but 19, but we did our best to contribute. And I would like you to tell me, what can we do? What do you think we can do to address all these challenges?
Thank you, Magali, and hello to everyone. You know, with the Solar Impulse airplane to fly around the world with no fuel, we had the challenge, of course, of getting the energy from the sun, but much more than that, we had the challenge of being energy efficient in order to save the energy that we got from the sun. And this was a challenge for us, as it is for the world. Today, 3/4 of the energy produced is lost by inefficient systems or wasted by bad behaviors. So basically, to understand the world, it's like a stupid guy in a bathtub with a leak in the bathtub. And instead of solving the leak, the guy is opening the tap wide open to add the water to compensate the loss. This is why we're in trouble today. Not only the sources of energy are polluting, but the sources of energy are wasted. So I wanted to show with the Solar Impulse Foundation that we can solve both parts of the equation, but in a profitable way. And this is why we launched this challenge of identifying solutions. That means technologies, systems, programs, processes, products, materials, sources of energy that would create jobs and make profits by replacing the old systems by the new ones. And we got 1,300, which are proofs that the protection of the environment is more profitable than the destruction of the environment. So of course, we work with big corporations, we work with countries. So we prepared, for example, a guide that we did for Scotland because it's the host country. So we did the guide. We took also some private industries like the whiskey company Glenmorangie to show what solutions can be used for them. And of course, in the building industry and construction, there is so much we can do. And part of it, we do it together with Holcim. So basically, we have to provide to the construction industry 3 different types of solutions. One is for the construction. And I think now the cement was a big part of the problem, can become a part of the solution, because you're working on cement that is absorbing CO2 instead of emitting CO2. So that will be life-changing, but this is not yet available. What is available today is cement that is 70% more CO2 free. So of course the construction can be in new materials, in insulation, in new type of heating systems. Just for the people to understand, a heat pump uses 4 times less energy than a normal electric radiator, and the half of the energy from a gas boiler or heating system. So there is a huge margin of improvement. And then, of course, in the way people live, there are so many things to make the building energy neutral by managing the energy. You know, basically a building can be a smart grid, receiving clean energy, distributing the energy, allowing the energy just where we need it. And I think all these solutions that have a return of investment in less than 5 years, because you reimburse the investment with a lower energy bill and with a lower cost of the building, all this has to be understood as a possibility to act today. And we should not just wait for new innovations to come and do nothing today, because we'll have a locked-in of the emissions on all the buildings that are built today for 50 years. So if we want to be carbon neutral in 2050, the buildings built today have to be energy neutral, have to be CO2 neutral, and maybe even energy positive. So what we want to do with the Solar Impulse Foundation is really to show that it is possible, that the materials exist, the product exists, the insulation exists, the heating system exists. Of course, the lighting systems exist, and you will speak about it, Harry. But just to show, there are still people who are using incandescent light bulbs that have an efficiency of 5%, when the LED has an efficiency of 95%. And because the incandescent light bulb is producing so much heat, you need a cooling system to compensate. So it's you are doing everything wrong with the old technologies. And today it's time to wake up and to use the technologies that are available, because they are profitable, because they exist, and because there's an urgency to use them. And it's wonderful to see that there are now panels like this one at the COP speaking about the profitability of new type of buildings, construction and heating and everything. That's a good sign. So not only international consensus, but also private action and coalitions in different industries.
Thank you, Bertrand. And I love the fact you talked about our cement and our concrete, because I agree with you. Innovation is fantastic. And I'm also in charge of innovation, so I would never say the contrary, but we shouldn't sit and wait for magic innovation to happen. We should use the one we have today. And what you mentioned is we have launched our global low carbon concrete range last year. In 1 year, we've now put it's in 24 markets in 1 year, which is incredible, but the demand is there, and that's what is so fantastic. And I will just give a quick example. In India, we are seeing a growth of selling that product by more or less 50% months on months. And it shows that you put the right solution, we even get a premium pricing on it. So exactly what you are defending, it's good for business, it's good for climate, and we are deploying it, and we can't make enough of it. Thank you very much, Bertrand. I will now turn to the industry representative, and I will start with you, Claire, and maybe before you start, you can tell us 2 words about your bicycling things, because I'm very interested by it. And so from your side, from your sector, what are the solutions you have today? What can you do today, if you want to tell us a bit about it?
Thank you. Oh, of course, this doesn't amplify, does it? It's just for the machine. So Claire Bonham Carter, I lead a global center of excellence for resilience and sustainability for AECOM, which is a global design, planning, and engineering firm. And I really focus on cities and counties as my client. So this panel is very appropriate for me. So to the bike ride. So yes, I cycled from London to Glasgow over 7 days. It's 500 miles, 65 to 90 miles a day. And I did it and I was riding with approximately 100 people that came the whole way. We did it to raise awareness of the need for urgent climate action, both that message for people here at the COP, but also for our friends and families and colleagues. And that was very much seen as an awareness raising exercise for them. And it was there's a what's called a Do Nation pledge platform that was used for the ride. So we weren't collecting money, wasn't fundraising for dollars or pounds or euros. It was climate action pledges. And by the end of, I think it's this week, the pledge platform will close. The organizers, Do Nation, will calculate the carbon reduction that will be saved if these people who have pledged carry out their pledge for 2 months, and they're going to be followed up with. And so there is some kind of tracking in there. Now, how does that link to this conversation? You know, the type of Bertrand, the type of little incremental actions that you talked about. So people changing their light bulbs, people changing their type of heating system is really important, even though that's a kind of bottom-up piece. And sure, there's need for power change, incremental change at the government level as well. But that kind of demand from the population, I think, can really help stimulate that supply side of things. And in terms of what, you know, there are other issues relating to, you know, implement, say, air source heat pumps, which you also mentioned. You know, if you want to retrofit your home right now and you call up a plumber or a contractor to do it, they may well not have actually ever installed an air source heat pump before, and they'll try and push the gas version on you. So I think there's an incredible opportunity for the trade associations, for community colleges, for cities to help basically upskill, capacity build the local workforce, so that when, you know, I call up and want a new furnace, a new boiler, the air source heat pump is offered instead. And AECOM is actually doing some work with community colleges to try and facilitate that kind of training scheme. And it goes beyond contractors, right? I mean, if you think about the number of cities you said need to be built over the next few decades, we actually don't have enough engineers probably in the workforce who understand net zero, low carbon to actually be able to do it. So as an industry, I think it's really on us to make sure we're helping both train internally our engineers, sort of from an organic perspective, but also working with trade associations to help with that piece too. AECOM is part of ICSI, the International Coalition for Sustainable Infrastructure, which is essentially a group of, you know, big engineering firms, the American Civil Engineering Society, ICE, the International Civil Engineering Group, which is the UK. And that's all about sort of collaboration with a big C. There's such a need for us to work together to make sure that the engineering world, actually in every single project we do, we're thinking about low carbon and resilient infrastructure. So, you know, I've talked about sort of air source heat pumps as, you know, a piece of equipment that can go into an individual's home, but there's also sort of big opportunity for improved energy efficiency, move towards lower carbon energy sources by harnessing existing waste heat. So I'd like to give an example of a project that AECOM was part of in Denver, in the US, for the National Western Center, which is part of Denver University, 250-acre campus, right next to a very large wastewater treatment system. And so what AECOM and Enwave Energy Corporation did is essentially put in a sewer heat recovery system, which basically harvests thermal energy from all the wastewater that's going into the system to be able to supply 90% of the heating and cooling of that whole 250-acre campus. So that's saving, you know, a lot of CO2 each year. It's something like 6 million passenger vehicles being removed from the road. And it also has an incredible environmental side benefit in that warm water that was being discharged to a river is no longer. So that environmental impact is taken away. So there's just, there's lots of opportunities like that in the US, elsewhere, where you have a kind of campus environment next to that kind of waste heat system, and to pull those two together. So that's a kind of much larger scheme and opportunity compared to the individual heat pump. Now let's see. So that's on the building side of things. And I just want to mention just one opportunity there is on the transportation side of things, where we're working a lot with our city clients, where transportation emissions are often a larger part of their greenhouse gas inventory than the building side of things. And fuel switching, so to electrification of vehicles, is something that all of the cities are looking at doing, and we're trying to help them figure out where electric vehicle charging points should go, right, within a city, so you can help encourage more people to switch to electric vehicles, and making sure that's done in an equitable way with appropriate financing, so you're bringing everybody along in that electrification journey. And that kind of electric vehicle master planning is something that we're working a lot with a number of city clients. And actually, finally, and I meant to talk about this with the building side of things, but concrete, you both mentioned concrete, and the embodied carbon in concrete and in all construction materials is something that we are starting to be asked about by clients in their projects as an important component of the life cycle carbon of any building. And AECOM has actually committed to reducing the carbon of our major projects by 50%. So looking at both embodied carbon and operational carbon. And AECOM is a big company, so that has potentially huge carbon reduction potential in our projects. And that's going to take a lot of work with us, working with our clients to help them understand the importance of that. And needing lower carbon concrete is a very important piece of that. We use tools like EC3, and I'm sure your concrete is part of that, where you can plug in where your project is, and it will share with you, the 4 or 5 different low carbon concrete options you have, and you can pick the lowest one for your project. And that's a very powerful tool, and something that I think the industry needs to work more on to facilitate more people really understanding the whole life cycle carbon from every piece of infrastructure in the building or infrastructure project. Thanks.
Thank you, Claire. Very interesting and a good tackle back on what was just discussed before. And I think you touched on something which I would like to say a couple of words about, is when we talk about life cycle assessment. When you look at the construction sector, it's about 38% of the total CO2 emission of the world, but 30% of it is due to the construction itself, and concrete is obviously part of it. 70% is due to the usage. And that's why I think it's very interesting that we're having the discussion about how do you heat better. And this is where, when you look at the life cycle assessment of a product, and you look at, if I build something with concrete and it's a low carbon concrete, but also will I need more heating or less heating, or maybe even cooling, I guess, more and more in the future. I think that's a very important discussion. And that's why we were supposed to be joined by the former mayor of Toronto, who is MD International Diplomacy C40, to bring his perspective on that. Unfortunately, he's a contact case, so he couldn't come for the good of us. But I really find it interesting to see cities moving more and more to ask for EPD, environmental product declaration. So when they build something, they really look at the full life cycle of CO2 over the 3 scopes. And I think that if we could push the construction to go in that direction, we see it in North America, but unfortunately not enough yet in Europe. I think that would be a great progress, a great way forward. So talking about usage of the building, and we already had a couple of things about the lighting, and maybe I can now ask you on the Signify side, what do you have to propose today?
Yeah, thank you, Magali. And first of all, thank you for the invitation to join. I think it's a really interesting panel, because then it's all about infrastructure. You mentioned in your title, you have sustainability and innovation. But actually that's logic, because sustainability is another word for innovation. And then also building on Bertrand's remark, then indeed, so the most important thing to do there is to reduce energy waste. And that is by tapping into the energy efficiency potential. And energy efficiency is not an invisible form of energy. It's actually, so what really needs to be done overall, and there's a bit of a difference between existing and new infrastructure, is for existing infrastructure to double renovation rates to like 3% per year. And for new infrastructure, obviously to leapfrog. Even there, one example that we are working on in developing countries is then solar LED street lighting. So then it is immediately zero if you succeed in leapfrogging. And the lighting is one part of what we call the energy efficiency domain. So indeed, heating, ventilation, building management systems, and lighting, and a few other areas. And yeah, from a city perspective, lighting is between 40 and 50% of their energy bill. So for public buildings, offices and schools, street lighting, and the potential is huge, because actually if you look at all technology, incandescent light bulbs, they were the first product around. They replaced candles and kerosene. So 100 years ago, that was fine. But then if you start from the utility, then actually only 1% of the input energy is turned into light. And with LEDs, indeed, it's like 95, so it's staggering. But then that also means that there's a huge saving potential. But what is relevant there with the infrastructure renovation rates is that even today, have we made a complete transition as a company? We are now 84% in sales in LED, but 2/3 of the installed base of all the light points that are there are still conventional technology, bulbs and tubes. And that's why this renovation rate needs to increase, because otherwise we won't be tapping into that potential. And we actually, 1 hour ago, actually 1 hour and 27 minutes ago, we issued a press release in which we calculated, like, where are we today? Because earlier on, we made some projections that we updated at several points in time. And we see now, also looking at that 2/3 of light points that are still conventional technology, that if those would be upgraded to LED, to connected LED, also like the IEA recommends, that you would save per year 553 megatons in CO2. It's the equivalent of 177 billion euros per year, but also the same as 494, of course you can round it off because it's modeling, but 494 million households. And what is interesting there, also looking at the second area of carbon reduction, which is transport, is that one electric car on average needs the same amount of electricity as an average household worldwide consumes. So one car is one household. So you actually, and buildings is where all electricity is being used. So if you renovate buildings, you can use that electricity for cars. And we've done some modeling on that in the past with the Rocky Mountain Institute. And let's look at it at the positive side. But if we don't accelerate infrastructure renovation and leapfrog, then in 2040, we would need the same additional amount of electricity as the whole of Europe consumes today. And so that shows there's really a relationship. And there's one more relationship, because all the new technology is digital, like connected LEDs becoming the backbone of smart cities in buildings and street lighting. But that also means that it can contribute to smart charging and making the building smart and other benefits that people really need, like productivity, daylight integration, and so forth. So we see that there's a huge potential. Most of all, we need to look at increasing those renovation rates and for new infrastructure to leapfrog straight away. And that requires a couple of things I think that we'll talk about in the panel later on business models and policies. But then this is a huge potential. And those new technologies actually make our living environments more comfortable at home and more productive, but also safer. Because last word on that, we have got some test results from Los Angeles and a few other cities where cities have switched from, let's say, energy wasting street lighting to connected LED, that also street crime, so burglary and assaults, are reduced by 20%, and nighttime traffic accidents are reduced by 30%. And you can imagine, for some people, light is light. Of course, we are a bit nerdy on lighting, but then with LED lighting, you get a better recognition of subjects. So people make less mistakes, less traffic accidents, and people are less naughty, let's say less crime. So those are real benefits that also a city mayor could sell to his citizens and then accelerate this whole progression.
Well, being a woman who happened to walk a lot at night in streets, I have to say that do appreciate when there is a good lighting. But before I go to the next question, you know, in case people hadn't noticed, I'm actually French. And that gave me the privilege to be able to already read Bertrand's new book, who has only been published in French so far. So I read it. No one else did, or except you wrote it. And the reason why I mentioned that is because there's something I read in your book, which I thought was absolutely amazing. And you touched it with electrical cars. And I would like you to say a few words about it, about how you consider the cars as should be considered as a battery. Do you want to? Because that was something that completely staggered me. Sorry to put you on spot.
No, it's true that it was just. I just touched it in my introduction when I was speaking that a building should be a smart grid. You have to use all the sources of energy and use it at the right time in the right place. The car should provide the energy for the house in certain moments of the day, because an electric car is very often viewed as a car with batteries. That's the electric car. For me, it's wrong. For me, an electric car is a battery on wheels. And maybe 5–10% of the time it's rolling, and 90 to 95% of the time it's in the parking slot. And in this moment, it should be always connected to a discharging station. So you charge it when you have enough energy from the wind, from the sun, and so on. And then you discharge it on the house in the evening when there is a peak of demand, which is usually answered by a peak of production with gas or importing electricity from coal when we are in Europe. So it's a huge advantage to come at home in the evening, you plug your car to the house, you discharge the battery on the house, and after midnight, when almost nobody uses energy, then you recharge the car for the next morning. And like this, you really put the car as an individual charging station for the benefit of the community. And it is a way to depreciate the forefront investment that you have in your electric car, because you sell this energy at a high rate because it's the moment everybody needs it. And we see that there are so many solutions everywhere like this and that people don't use. Why? Because the regulation is not adapted. The regulation does not allow today to discharge your car on the house because they don't know how to use the electricity on the grid, which is a wrong answer, because Schneider Electric has a way to isolate the house from the grid in order to be fed entirely by the car. And it's also now quite bad to see that all the chargers don't allow the discharge. So we have a lock-in problem with all the chargers and the electric cars today who cannot be used to charge the buildings. So regulation has to be adapted very soon. And also one thing that holds people back from everything we are doing here is the upfront investment. If you make a new house, new building, it's about 10% more expensive, but after 5 years, you get the money back. If you make a retrofitting of your house in terms of insulation or in terms of heating and lighting systems, it's also an upfront investment, but you depreciate it in 5 years, you get the money back. So we need to find an encouragement in the funding of the people who want to do good in construction and retrofitting. And this starts to be a business for banks. BNP Paribas is doing this for a lot of their clients. They pay like basically the retrofit becomes a leasing. And the additional price for heating and construction and so on becomes a leasing. So as soon as we can include the financement of something that is clean, I think we can push it and speed it up very, very fast.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. So then we are moving away from an economy of ownership, but then let's say of usership. And we see that also with lighting. The problem is not the lack of understanding, but then indeed the budget, either the renovation budget or the slightly higher initial budget. And that is why we launched lighting as a service. So actually people pay per use in the same way as actually for leasing a car, you pay for use. So you don't necessarily need to cough up all the thousands of euros to buy a car. And then a bank lends the money, and they pay, let's say they pay us because we're not a bank. So we can continue to do this for other customers, but then actually the user, they just pay monthly fee on the amount of light they use. And interestingly, because technology is becoming digital, you know exactly how much they have used, but also you know what's working, what needs, let's say, some attention. And I think this is the economy. Instead of invoicing hardware, we should go to leasing services.
Yeah.
I just had a sort of follow-up question for you, just thinking about not just the individual car, electric car, but buses. You know, lots of cities, transportation agencies are looking to transition their fleet to electric. We're doing a lot of work with cities around that in electrifying their fleet. And I'm just thinking, presumably buses with much bigger batteries could play the same role as being a battery source for a public building. And I wasn't sure if that is possible, but do you see that as a route forward also for the public sector buildings and batteries?
It's true that buses have bigger batteries, but the difference with individual cars is that they are driving all the time. So basically, they are never stopped at night, but at night, nobody uses the peak of demand, or let's say there is no peak of demand during the night. In the evening, if they could be stationary between 6 and 9 o'clock in the evening, then it would make sense. But usually there are people going home at that moment. So I don't see the buses to be so much useful, or school buses, absolutely, school buses. But what we have to see is that a lot of public procurements today are still giving the priority to the cheapest solution when they buy it, and not the cheapest on the total cost of ownership. And you have cities today who buy diesel buses because it's cheap, and they don't understand that over 10 years, compared to an electric bus, they are losing $400,000 per bus because the diesel bus has more maintenance and fuel. So we need to find, of course, the upfront investment to help these public communities, but we also need a change in the rules of the public procurement to oblige the buyer to take care of the 10-year cost and not just the purchase price.
Thank you. So I suggest we move on, because it looks like we could continue like that. And I personally enjoy the discussion, but we're in Glasgow. We are at the COP26 at the moment where policymakers are discussing, things are happening, few things have happened already. There's been quite a few. So I would like to ask each of you if there was one public policy measure that you would like to see happening in order to incentivize and to develop that dynamic market of net zero solution that we've been talking about. What would it be? Is there a volunteer to start? Claire, shall I start with you? Or?
Okay, so choosing one was challenging, obviously. No, one is fine. One is fine. So this is on the building electrification side of things. And we're seeing in California, I'm actually based in San Francisco, that a number of cities, I think it's probably reached 40 or 50 cities, have actually put a ban on fossil fuels going into new construction. So they're not allowed to put gas into new construction homes and businesses. And I think there are some exceptions, but that's an incredible market driver because developers just can't put gas in anymore. And we worked in a project in San Francisco, it was probably 5 or 6 years ago, where we were recommending a low thermal loop district heating system for a mixed use community. Works really well because the commercial buildings issue heat during the day. The houses at night want the heat at night. So it's perfect synergy. But at the time, it was going to cost a little bit more. There was going to be a slightly longer payback, and the developer wasn't willing to go there. 5 or 6 years later, in San Francisco, you're no longer allowed to put natural gas into new developments. And so the developer is coming back to us, asking us to revisit the business case that we put forward. And so it becomes a game changer if that kind of public policy is in place to prevent to basically require developers to be going down the electrification route. And I'm not sure if that is a public policy that's yet in other parts of Europe, but to me, it sends such a strong signal to the market that electrification is the way to go. It will mean that things like the upfront cost of air source heat pumps will come down much more quickly than if it's just sort of organically over time. And a good example of that actually happening was in the UK when I was working here. The Part L regulations, I think it was around 2004-05, basically made it a requirement that you had to have a condensing boiler, so a more energy efficient boiler. They used to be, a premium price. Very, very quickly, that cost came down to be the same as any other. So that would be my request to policymakers to put in a ban essentially on natural gas into new buildings.
So if we choose different ones, then we get more done. So thanks, Claire. So now actually I would like to come back to procurement because for part it's the way that we choose things is also driven by the processes that are there. But those are processes of yesterday. And procurement, we see that also we have a saying like the cheapest lamp is the most expensive. So indeed, like Bertrand mentioned, so the cheap things that are promoted through old procurement processes are actually then punishing us going into the future. So maybe even for procurement, it should be life cycle focused, but maybe we should come up with a fancy term that actually increases attention for this policy, because it's not an easy policy, but like circular procurement or net zero carbon procurement, something that revives the interest and the attention to work on this, but then to give it a life cycle perspective, and not only in cost, but also in carbon. Because if then the procurement process would ask of a city and of a company to compare decisions, and not only on life cycle cost, but in the same way, and of course they're exactly related, also in the carbon impacts, then they see the numbers, and decisions are often made on basis of numbers. So if the numbers are lacking in today's procurements, but if they would be included in tomorrow's procurements, then everybody will start in the same automatic way, making those decisions. And we also feel that we've had remarks in the past, where we say, but then I've got no money. But that's where indeed the service model comes in. But let's also not forget that in today's economic recovery, there are trillions around that are looking for projects. So even with our commercial teams, we're saying we're living in the reverse world, because normally your projects are looking for money, but now there's money in Europe and hopefully soon also in the US, is looking for projects. So this is the right time to combine the two. But then through, let's say, circular or net zero carbon procurement processes that show the numbers. And when people see numbers, they're more often easily convinced instead of just qualitative arguments.
Now, I agree. I'm actually proud of a title I earned this year, which was Sustainable Women Supply Chain of the Year. And I think the fight for life cycle assessment and total cost of ownership that you mentioned, it's an ongoing fight. And I always used to say, because I've had a part of my past, I had some supply chain roles, and I always used to say, you need to be very rich to buy something cheap. And the way I was always explaining the total cost of ownership was using a washing machine. If you buy a cheap washing machine, because of course I'm a woman, I'm very interested by washing clothes. And if you buy a cheap washing machine, it will certainly use more electricity. It might damage your clothes and you will have to replace it very soon. But I think now you add the dimension of the cost of usage and you realize that it makes no sense. So I turn to you, Bertrand, to give us your policy, and maybe I will also task you to wrap up that panel, if you don't mind.
Thank you. Jonathan just told me that I will need to move quite quickly to give a speech to Switzerland by Zoom. So maybe I will leave you the honor of wrapping up, but I don't want to leave before giving also my opinion on the measures that have to be taken. And in addition to what Claire and Harry said, which is absolutely relevant, I would like to add another thing. It is the obligation to use the most efficient known systems. Because today, it's not obligatory, it's not mandatory to use the efficient systems, which means that a lot of industries, a lot of private people are polluting a lot. They're putting a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere. And the answer, what I do is legal. I'm following the rules. So the rules must change. And in order to make an obligation to use the latest systems or the most efficient systems, we need to include the innovators in the group of people who decide what are the norms and the standards. Because today the norms and the standards are decided by very well-established industries who have absolutely no idea of what exists in the solution guides that we are finding, because they are startups that nobody knows about, even if their products should be used everywhere. So this is really a change that I would like to see happening.
Thank you, Bertrand. Thank you very much for being with us. And I realize you have to run, so I'll let you run. And I will wrap up. I really enjoy the discussion. I think we have come up with a few solutions. We have come up with a few policies we would have to ask on the procurement side, on how cities really have to be quite strong about their requirement, but also about the fact that those solutions exist today. We have, of course, the 1,300 from the Solar Impulse, but also I mentioned now low carbon concrete. You have all your lighting and leasing, etc. I think those solutions that exist, and we might have found a new one now with using the batteries. I think between all of us, we might be able to do something there on this usage of the batteries of the car. So I think that was very useful. I thank you very much for participating, and that will be the end of this panel. Thank you.